Hi, welcome to LaunchLeft, an intentional space for art and activism, a podcast, a label, a launchpad for left-of-center artists. Today's guest is Thurston Moore. We'll be talking about his new record, By the Fire, which is phenomenal, and I hope you get it and listen to it and love it as much as I do. I have a long history of loving Sonic Youth and Thurston's work since I was 16 when I heard Daydream Nation and Evil before that, and it changed my life. And then I had the incredible good fortune Alec Attic opened for Sonic Youth on my 18th birthday in Miami, Florida, which was a milestone as well. So I'm super excited to speak to Thurston. One last thing, don't forget to rate and subscribe. Follow us on all socials at LaunchLeft. And now welcome to the show, Thurston Moore. Thank you for being on the show. Your record is spectacular.
Thank you. We met a long time ago, didn't we? Yeah. So we played together in Miami. Remember that?
I do. It was my 18th birthday. It's hard to forget.
That's right. Oh my God, that's so funny. I totally remember that gig. I guess I remember it was your birthday. Yeah, there was something going on in that respect. Yeah.
I remember that because I was like already a huge fan of Sonic Youth. Daydream Nation came out when I was 16, and it changed like how I felt about music. And
yeah.
So for me to get to open on my 18th was like, oh, so I remember it very well. I think I've bugged Kim a number of times about that.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
My mother was at that show.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I grew up in. I didn't grow up, but I was born in Coral Gables, and I lived in South Miami for a while before we moved north. And so she was down there because she had her sister was down there, and they were all at that show. I remember. And it was when Miami Beach was really. A different vibe then. It was like really kind of how they say in England, really dodgy.
Yeah.
A lot of police, a lot of drug dealing going on. Just not a pleasant atmosphere. Eventually it got really moneyed and sort of it changed. But yeah, that's so funny. Oh, it's good to see you.
I know. It's only been like 30 years or something.
It's been a while, yeah.
But you collaborated a little with, I know Steve Shelley was in part of this record, right?
Yeah, Steve I always play with Steve when I get a chance. I mean, he lives in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is kind of a long distance music affair we have. And, it's made it even more difficult to sort of play with musicians from across the water now that travel restrictions are so in place. But the music I played with Steve on this record was done during a session I did for a record called Rock and Roll Consciousness a couple of years ago. And this was a piece of music that I wanted to use on that record, but it was just too unwieldy. It was too like, kind of big and heavy for that record. And I sort of held on to it, and it worked in this sequence. So that's the only song Steve plays on. I usually use a drummer here in London that I like called Jem Dalton, who plays on most of this record. And Deb plays on everything. Deb is great. I've been playing with Deb for, I've been living here about 8 years. Just about, 7 or 8 years. And I met Deb pretty early on. I mean, I knew Deb from My Bloody Valentine. The Sonic Youth and My Bloody Valentine would do shows together through the years. One of their very first early shows was supporting Sonic Youth at a little club in Glasgow, Scotland, in the mid '80s. And it was this cool little gig that we were playing, and it was being promoted by the bass player Douglas Hart of Jesus and Mary Chain, who were they were also kind of new at that point. And we really liked them. We kind of connected with them when we were over here. And Douglas put this gig on in Glasgow, which is where they all came from anyway. And he drove up this new band that he was friends with, My Bloody Valentine, to play this gig. So I remember that very, very well. I could still see them. Like Deb must have been like 19 years old, and they were just like a jangly kind of indie pop band. They weren't what they became, and what they became was something else entirely within like a year or so. And I think they were really kind of intrigued by what was going on with bands like us and Dinosaur Jr., who had come over. And And so Kevin Shields really amped it up and sort of, I think he remodulated his focus of what that band was, and they were spectacular. I mean, and they were really distinctive. They didn't sound anything like Sonic Youth or Dinosaur Jr. They sounded like something entirely else, and they were beautiful. That first record like that was so great. And because I remember reading like reviews of My Bloody Valentine a year or so later after that gig, and the reviews were like these like, this is the most important band in London right now, and their gigs are just incredible experiences. And I was like, what? They're just like a jangly pop band. I was like staring at their feet. But then I got it. Then I got it when I heard them. And then they came over to New York, and they played all these little places in New York at that time. We just hung out with them, and they were just great. So
you've known them since then, since the 80s?
Yeah. But I didn't really know Deb that well. I mean, I was very friendly with Kevin, and I knew Belinda, and they were kind of like, the power couple of the band. And so that was sort of that connection. And I knew Deb, but I never really had much of a repartee with her. But when I moved here, I started playing with this guitar player, James Sedgwick, who I continue to play with. And I was talking about trying to locate someone to play bass. And he said, and he was friends with Deb, and he said, well, Deb's not doing anything, and I just thought that was an incredible idea. I didn't think she would actually be up for it. I don't know, but I invited her over to my little flat, and we had a bottle of wine, and we talked into the night, and then we started a band together. And that was years ago, and we still play together, and it's a really cool group.
I guess my question out of all of that is like, you were just doing what you were doing, and Sonic Youth was born in that way that like made such a big influence on so many people for a long time now. At the time when you were a kid, when you guys were starting it, do you feel like you knew you'd be where you are now, where you're in London and can live and make records?
No, I mean, I used to have aspirations to possibly, coming into New York and playing with different musicians in the late 70s, the idea was like the biggest big time you could get was like a Saturday night at CBGB's, if you could ever attain such a thing. And I think at that age, you don't really sort of think too far ahead. I mean, I don't really think musicians and artists in their late teens and early 20s really have future vision so much. I think you really are sort of like living day to day, and you don't really have that shelf life feeling that you get later on in life, where it's like where time becomes so precious, and so I don't think any of us, as the four of us got together, well, I should say the three of us, because it was mostly me, Kim, and Lee, and then we had a succession of drummers. And it settled on Steve Shelley, but at first it was Bob Burt. And, when I came to New York, for me, it was just wanting to be in a band and playing music that I was really intrigued by. I was always sort of drawn towards what was happening more on the margins of like the rock scene, which I didn't have any issues with. I didn't have any issues with like the contemporary rock scene of like the Beatles or the Stones or even like Yes or the Allman Brothers Band or Emerson, Lake and Palmer. What was happening in the 70s? I thought there was great contemporary music in the 70s, from Bowie to to whatever the Stones were doing at that time, or what Paul McCartney was doing, what John Lennon was doing, and Allman Brothers Band, all these bands, Yes, and I loved it all. But I was really curious about what was happening when I saw photographs of like, Iggy Pop, spray painted silver and standing on top of the audience's upstretched hands, and like, what is that? Like, what does that sound like? We're seeing pictures of the MC5 or seeing pictures of Captain Beefheart, thinking like, what does that person sound like? And being really curious in this music that was rather subversive, and it always kind of paid off as soon as I would locate the documents. You play those records; they were just so unlike anything else that was being played commercially, and I was really drawn towards it. And I was drawn towards people who would write about it the writers were as important to me as the musicians, like Lester Bangs and Patti Smith was writing about a lot of this. Before Patti made a record, I just remember her as a byline in certain magazines. And I thought her byline was cool because it was always lowercase. And then when you saw a picture of her in like a early 70s Cream magazine, she was like, she was like this androgynous wonder, and her poetry was really cool. And then she made a record. She made a 7-inch in 74, 75. And I remember sending away for that. Like, what does a rock writer sound like making rock? And it was so stark and raw and minimal. And it was like a recitation on it. And Tom Verlaine was playing a scratchy guitar. And it was just like completely unlike all the grandiose music that was happening everywhere. And it sounded completely urban at a time when urban music wasn't really the thing in music culture. It was all about James Taylor and going back to the country and leaving the city. The city wasn't cool. The city was bad. But Patti was the city, and she was like, that was the sound. And New York Dolls was the sound of the city. Or hearing the Stooges and knowing it was the sound of the city. And so that to me was a big change. It was like this kind of new heralding of like what the sound of the city, the urban was, as opposed to the rural, the Crosby, Stills, Nash Young, Joni Mitchell, the kind of the glory of the rural communal, get away from the expectations of standard society. And so that was a big change. And so I went to New York looking for that primarily. And I met up with some students who came out of Rhode Island School of Design, and they were the next class after like Talking Heads people. And I started playing with them. And I even got my first day job at a kind of a modernist furniture place in Midtown Manhattan. And it was a shipping clerk job in the basement. But I took this job because Chris France, the drummer of the Talking Heads, had it. And he left because his band was getting too busy. And so one of these guys I was playing with said, there's this job opening that Chris had. I never met Chris France. To this day, I never met him. But I did take his job.
Yeah,
so I like.
What I was thinking. You took his lead on a good pre-gig job,
Yeah. So I just got, and then I would see all those bands, and it was a really interesting sort of dichotomy, because there was like this really sort of like just typical traditional rock and roll band, like the Heartbreakers, and even the Patti Smith group was just like, they were just like a rock and roll group. They just happened to have this singer who was just completely amazing and unusual. Blondie. I mean, they were just playing rock and roll, but at the same time, there's all this otherness that was going on in groups like the Talking Heads, or even a band like Suicide, which is just two guys playing like, just overamped keyboard noise and just so those two things kind of like really sort of, for me, were it was all about how to start a band that sort of kind of unified those two things, that really traditional kind of rock and roll thing. I mean, the Ramones were like a traditional rock and roll band, but they were so completely unique, and a lot of it had to do with just because of their not having the traditional technique of other bands. They kind of use their limitations for this incredible performance, and that was really inspiring. They were so minimal at a time when minimalism was like this, strand of discipline that was happening in the art world. It's like stripping away of the effluvia of the work and getting to the essence of it and sort of locating it and sort of just displaying it and
getting great job of that. Yeah,
but I don't think the Ramones were like going to like galleries and looking at minimalist art.
Right. No, I don't either. But it's interesting. I didn't put that's a cool correlation that, that during that time that was something happening in art, and they probably didn't, but it was almost like that thing where you pick up through the, the ether, like how everyone kind of picks up the same resonant frequency sometimes, but in different ways, uses it in art, You might not even know it. I find that always very interesting, that idea of just sort of like putting your antenna out and picking up on what's happening, but doing it your way,
It's very true. I mean, it's a bit of a metaphysic thing. And so it's like the information is just like, it's really magical. And it happens through history quite a bit. And so it was in retrospect, it was completely curious to think about that band coexisting with like all this other kind of minimalist tendency that was going on. I thought they were like, when I first heard about them, to me, they were coming out of like a glam thing, they were just like, as if they were like the Bay City Rollers or something, because glam rock and glitter rock was always this kind of leapfrogging back over the 60s hippie world and going right into like 50s, kind of like, the beginnings and like the genesis of rock, and trying to get to this kind of primalcy of it. And, Roxy Music and Bowie did that, it was like this kind of 50s thing that they would do. And I thought the Ramones were doing that, like, the leather jackets and the t-shirts and the ripped jeans. They were a gang, they were sort of like, it was like kind of like Marlon Brando or something. But, but they were kind of, but they were like dweebs, it was high concept, they were like, they all had the same last name or something. They might as well have been Slade or something. But the fact that they just like, they played the way they played, which is like, that's all they could do. It was like play like these kind of 3 or 4 chords and different variants of, it was just kind of great.
So great though, like so infectious, that music, and just you felt the aliveness of it, like regardless of their lack of ability or, it still felt like something really important.
Yeah, it was, because it was so unique, and it was like, it was really funny and it was fun, and it just like, it really was just like shocking. It was amazing. I mean, there's that famous Lou Reed cassette that you could hear that Danny Fields had made when he played the Ramones cassette for him the first time, and Lou Reed is just like, "That's it. It's all over. They've discovered, they've discovered it all. Here it is. This is the most beautiful thing ever." It's in. You can hear a little bit of it in the. There's a documentary about Danny Fields called Danny Says. That's kind of really cool. I think it's in there. I think that's where I heard it.
Are you like? Would you call yourself a rock and roll historian of the music you like?
I'm super obsessive. I mean, I've been writing a lot about like that era and of the 70s going into the 80s, and being a teenager and sort of getting engaged with the music scene of the downtown New York diaspora, and how Sonic Youth sort of formed in 80, 81 and came out of that. And I've been writing a lot about that lately, because since I've had all this time at home, and I've never really had downtime for ages. And so I just was able to sort of do this. And so I created this manuscript called Sonic Life that I wrote. And I really do get into the details. I'm really interested in like the documents that kind of inspire and inform people at a young age, that defines their vocation for the rest of their lives. So talking about, say, like that first Patti Smith 7-inch, or the first Ramones album, or just all those initial documents that were coming out from like 76 until like 79, 80. And the Sonic Youth as a band starts around late 80 into 81. And so I spent an inordinate amount of time discussing like the significance of those records, and the magazines and the fanzines and the literature and what was happening just like in the city of New York. I talk a lot about the environment of like what kind of city it was. And so it's There's a lot of geography as well. And I just thought I would lay into it and just talk a lot about that.
When is that coming out, or are you keeping?
No, I don't know. Whenever they let us all back into the pool, I don't know. This whole lockdown thing, it's like a prison term. I mean, that's a prison term, isn't it? Lockdown. Maybe we should change the word president and turn it into warden.
Hey, I have another writing question about you, though. You teach still sometimes at Naropa, is that right? Which is something
in Naropa University.
Yeah, so I've heard a lot about that.
That plays well. Allen Ginsberg and Ann Waldman were the founders of the summer writing workshop that is part of Naropa University. At that time, it was in '74 they founded it, and it was the Naropa Institute then. I think it got accredited to be a university some years later. And the school itself was founded by this Buddhist practitioner, scholar, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche.
Yeah, he's the coolest.
Yeah. And so he was like he had this thing called crazy wisdom, which was like this much sort of it's a bit more of an open idea or I guess idea of how to be a practicing Buddhist in the USA, especially at that time in the 70s. And he was Ginsberg's guy, his yogi. I think they met in New York just by chance, like crossing the street. And then Ginsberg became a devotee to him. And either Alan asked or he asked Alan to start a school of poetry there. And they did. And it kind of, through the years, it became more established and somewhat disciplined. I think it was pretty much a wild place to go to, like in the late 70s. It was really open. But the teachers there, my God, it was like William Burroughs, Kathy Acker, Cecil Taylor. I mean, everybody they knew in the New York scene and just around the world that like these really, they would give them teaching jobs at the school. And can you imagine being on a campus with these teachers? I mean, it must have been amazing. So I was always really curious about it. You know, I never really went to the poetry project that much in the 70s and 80s because I was just preoccupied with what I was doing. But I lived near it. I knew about it. And I had this idea that that's what I was going to do when I came to New York is like, you know, like be a writer and hang out with the poets. But I would see Ted Berrigan and all these people just all the time on the streets. But they were also all going to CBGB. And so you would see Allen Ginsberg at a lot of gigs just jumping on stage and chanting and playing his harmonium. And I remember like seeing Eileen Miles there early on. And St. Mark's Poetry Project had a fire in the late 70s, and they did like a week-long benefit at CBGB. And I remember like being there and seeing all those poets there. But they were kind of older people. I was like 20-something years old. They were kind of older. They'd been around a while, and so you know, for me, that probably is what kind of gave me a bit of a distance from going there. Like, you know, these guys were too experienced, and I was like a fawn. It probably would have damaged me if I went there. I don't know.
Yeah. But now you do teach a little at that.
Yeah.
What is now an accredited university, what used to be Crazy Wisdom headquarters.
Crazy Wisdom. Ann Waldman came up to Northampton when we were living in Northampton, Massachusetts, and Byron Coley, the writer, and myself were doing these kind of salons at this book and record space that we had called the New Grass Center for the Arts. And so we'd have lots of different underground basement noise people come up or folky people come up and play. And we'd have poetry readings. We have Gerard Malonga come up, and Ann Waldman came up. And we kind of had met, but we didn't really know each other. And she saw my library, I had spent years archiving like post-war underground Mimeo poetry. and just trying to figuring out the links between like the New York scene and the West Coast scene and the Midwest scene around Cleveland and the Canadian scene, and all of these documents that to me were like punk rock records. They were artist made, and they were just used to sort of exchange hands so people would learn from each other. Like what contemporary poetics was. And so I became really super into collecting this stuff because it was disappearing from the culture. And I would go on tour, crisscrossing USA, and I would go to every bookstore in every college town and go to the poetry section, which was always in the back, in the dust, with a cat sleeping on top of it. And that's where all these staple poetry mimeos were, for pennies per pound. And I amassed this huge collection. So Anne saw this. And in 1 second, she glanced at it, and then she said, "I want you to teach at the school." And I said, "Well, I don't teach." I mean, my father was a teacher. I kind of know what the education scene is, but I was caught surprised. But that was about 7-8 years ago, and so it was at this really interesting time in my life, and I went, and it was fantastic. It was really beautiful. It's a great place, and it's a really spiritual place. I've met such wonderful people there. Anne has been like a real mentor for me through the years. I was supposed to be there this summer, but of course that didn't happen. And you create your own curriculum. I would teach like usually sort of like the recorded works of Allen Ginsberg, like Allen Ginsberg, his connection with making recordings and records, and his connection with like music. I did the same thing with William Burroughs. I talked a lot about sort of the poetry connection between St. Mark's Poetry Project and CBGB. So there's a lot of talking about Richard Hell and Patty and Tom Verlaine and that, something like that. And then I did a class that was all about radical poetics of like Anna Mendelssohn, who was a poet who was part of the Angry Brigade here in London in the early 70s. I got to hang out and meet amazing people like, Amiri Baraka would be there. It was just fantastic. I would, to me, Boulder, Colorado is, I think if the time ever comes where I relocate to the USA again, it would be top of my list. I love Boulder. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, that is a very progressive town.
Yeah.
And it's just like in the most beautiful setting that feels like it's not going to be moved as much by fire, earthquake, and famine as other places.
Yeah.
Sorry to be doomsday. Hey, and also we might be letting Stella from Big Joanie in.
Eva and I put her record out, Big Joanie's record out last year. And it's sensational. We first saw them like somewhat by accident. They were opening up for this band called The X, old friends of mine from Amsterdam, anarcho punk band, for want of a better term. And so we went to see The X, and Big Joanie was on the bill, and we were just like completely blown away. And we asked them if they, had it. We went to the merch table. They were hanging out there, and we asked them if they had any cassettes or 7 inches or T-shirts or stickers. They had nothing. They had absolutely nothing. And they said they had recorded a session, but they were at a loss of how to put it out. So we put it out.
That's so cool. Yeah, from what I've watched and listened to, it's so good and so fun and
they're
alive,
great. Yeah.
Do you put a lot of different artists out, or is it kind of a fledgling?
No, it was created just to support putting the Big Joanie record out. And I had put a record out around the same time called Rock and Roll Consciousness that I did on a label called Fiction, which is like the Cure's label. And that was cool. I like doing that. But I think when it came time to do another record, it really was of the mind, like just keep it completely independent and in-house and DIY. It's become more apparent that is just the way to work in the music business right now.
Yep.
Which I don't have any issue with,
Right.
It's nice to sort of have people doing things for you and be catered to, but it's also nice to have everything within your own control and not having this, you have nobody to point the finger at except for yourself kind of thing when doing things. Because
you're kind of always been a bit left center, that it's an easier transition for artists who are already thinking outside the box than for those, that we're kind of part of a machine.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, we work with a manufacturer distributor,
right,
called Cargo Records. So
they're great. Yeah,
and I've worked with them before. I used to do Ecstatic Peace as a music label when I was living in the States for a number of years, and I would use Cargo here in the UK. So it was my partner Eva's idea to do this label, and I said, whoa, that's it costs a little bit of coin to do a record label. You can't just it's not like making a fanzine or something. And so I connected her with the people at Cargo who I remember working with, and they were just great. They were still cool, and I really liked them. And so we've been dealing with them. They did my last record last year. Well, it wasn't a record. It was a record, but it was actually 3 CDs in a box. It wasn't on vinyl because it didn't fit, and it was only 3 songs, but they were so long they had to go on a CD each.
Talk about Big Joanie.
We are talking about Big Joanie. Everyone was Big Joanie.
God, we were.
Big Joanie. Talk about Big Joanie. Stop talking about yourself. So it all started when I was 5 years old, and I had this vision that I was going to be a big no-wave superstar. And now we got well, Estella's not here yet. We're waiting for her.
Oh, she's in the waiting room, Chris?
She's in the waiting room. Bring her out.
Bring her in. Oh, wow, it's Estella from Big Joanie.
Big Joanie had a bit of an existence before Estella joined, right?
Yeah, so I think I joined after they'd already released their first single and first EP. But I'd actually had played some of the same shows as Big Joanie, but in different bands, kind of on the DIY scene before I joined the band.
How did music find you?
Estella, you take that one. I've been talking too much.
Well, I feel I did mention it to Thurston earlier today, actually, but my family was always quite into music. I have very early memories of being at home and my dad playing all his old records in the living room and stuff. And my parents and one of my sisters was always, they all played instruments and everything. So I got sent off to piano lessons when I was 4 and just kind of started from there, and then kind of took up various instruments. I don't know if they do it in the States. Here in the UK, when you get to year 6, I think you're about 10, everybody, it might have been earlier than that, but everybody goes through a phase where they make you play the recorder. So we did that at school.
Uh-huh.
And then after that, I played the clarinet. And then I thought I was going to go on and learn to play saxophone. But I started listening to this alternative rock radio station. And that was it at 13. I was oh no, I'm getting a guitar. I'm not forget saxophone. I'm not doing that. So I got an electric guitar. And later down the line, when I first started playing in bands, eventually someone just asked if I'd play bass in their band. So I started doing that. And at some point, some of my friends wanted to start a Riot Girl band, and they needed a drummer. And I didn't play drums, but I said I'd join and play them anyway. So then I started drumming. So it was kind of always there. And I've always had an interest in music. I used to write about it at uni. I was one of the music editors paper, and then I've worked in music venues. And I learned to do live sound in a venue in London. So it was kind of just always there in some form anyway.
Very cool. And what about you, Thurston? How did music find you? Like, what was that first moment for you where you were like, music, that's going to be what I do?
It was not too dissimilar. My father was, he was a music teacher. He played piano in the house all the time. And it was just classical music that he was always playing. So I kind of I was reactionary to that. So I kind of, the least classical music I can get involved with, I think, was sort of the idea. But there was, because of him, there was always music in our household. And his mother, my grandmother, she was like a society pianist in South Florida. And so we grew up in this household where we were kind of expected to take piano lessons. So we were sat at the piano, and, when all your friends are kind of outside playing, you were like taking piano lessons, and you're just like, this last thing you wanted to do. But I kind of gleaned enough to, take me through the years. And then I have an older brother who's 5 years older, and he brought an electric guitar into the house, and that changed everything. And he brought records into the house. I was born in 1958. So when I was like 5 or 6 years old, like in the early 60s, 1963 was when Louie Louie came out by the Kingsmen. I remember him bringing that home as a little kid and playing Louie Louie on my father's like old console, like in the bedroom. And that to me broke everything open. I was just like, that sound, that was punk rock, it was like the Kingsmen, and that stayed with me forever. And so that's that.
Very cool. Also, I meant to ask you, what's your form of activism?
I think putting a record out to me is always a political move. It's because it's an exchange with socially, it's public, and it's inherently political, so there's a certain responsibility there for me when I putting records out. I always think about what you're putting out has to be really, something that is a dialogue, a debate, and of sorts. It could be anything. It could be just sort of love songs, or it could be like hardcore protest music, or anything in between. But it's just that it's an offering. So it's sort of like, to me, it's like putting sort of a conscientious kind of language out there that in a world of so much kind of manipulated and chatter that's sort of driven by all these degrees of ambition that kind of are overpowered by this kind of this idea of control and greed. And so I think it's really important to put these records out. When we put Big Joanie's record out, the one thing that we got back from that more than anything was just like, so many people were happy and joyful that this record came out. And that to me was like completely political, that was like, so I think there's a great dignity in people who put their work out there for the world to hear. And, in a space that is so rammed with like distortion of ideologies that are just all about ego.
And Estella, is there something you're working on right now that you want to share?
Well, I feel like, that discussion kind of reminded me of when I attended, I think it was the Girls Rock Camp Association conference. So I volunteer with Girls Rock London, which is part of the wider Girls Rock movement. But when I went to conference, which would have been 2 years ago now, I think the theme of the weekend was actually joy is a revolutionary force. And that just felt really like relevant to kind of the discussion we're having, and I guess the power in being able to just connect with people, even just through music. And it's something I've missed through playing live, because what you're talking about, that sense of like a dialogue, Thurston, as well, it always felt really palpable at our shows, and it felt, I guess, when you're on stage, it's kind of like you literally have a captive audience, and it always felt like it was our time to explain exactly what Big Joanie is about, like the fact that we are a Black feminist punk band, and these are our principles, and we created the band specifically to create a space where Black women could bring their whole selves to the table. And I guess over the past few years, it's just been something that we've been able to share, and people from whatever background have been able to, I guess, connect with us in some way. So that's something really missing. So I guess in the meantime, we're still like working on the same kind of stuff we've always been working on. And really, like, Shireen's quite politically active. I'm still active with Girls Rock, and me and Steph have been involved with Decolonise Fest, which is a festival in London that's run by punks of colour, for punks of colour, and the collective behind that just put on an online festival, and that was really successful. And I guess one of the opportunities that has been brought since Corona is thinking more about holding these online events that aren't just based geographically. So we were able to have like a huge panel on the Sunday that had punks from literally all over the world and all kinds of different time zones. So I think one person drew the short straw and was up at about 4, but it was just cool to see how we all had these similar experiences. So I'm just glad we're still able to do stuff like that.
And are you guys working on another, I think you put something out in May, right? A single? But are you
we just released a cover of Solange's Cranes in the Sky with Third Man Records. And then on the B-side, we've got a live version of a track from Sisters called It's You. So it's a bit more raucous than maybe some people have been used to hearing on Sisters. That's something we had been playing live, I guess, over the past year and stuff. And it'd always been really fun, and it was good to be able to lay that down in the studio last year and finally kind of get it out there. But we've been back in the studio and we're working on album 2, so
right on
in 2021.
What I found really incredible is like Big Joanie is part of this whole community here in London that is completely activist intellectually and also just like in the streets. And that to me has been like one of the great things about living here is just discovering this culture of bands that are compatriots of Big Joanie's, and there's quite a few of them. And she talks about like Decolonise Fest, which a lot of the bands are involved with, as well as Girls Rock London. And it's just there's a few sort of organizations that collaborate together and do this work, and they're always raising sort of consciousness. And so when you see Big Joanie in concert, they talk about this on stage, between songs, and not in like proselytizing kind of like, but it's just like they proffer this information, and they show what their benign ideology is, in the face of this kind of, and this encroaching totalitarianism we have in the USA, and it's so important. It's so important. So I mean, for us to just have any kind of intimacy with a band like Big Joanie is really, really special.
Thank you guys so much.
Bye guys.
Bye. Have a good one. See you soon.
My name happens to be Thurston Moore, and I'm here with Rain Phoenix. I'm here with Estella from Big Joanie, and I have this privilege of launching the Fall Asleep video right here, baby.
If I ever fall asleep LaunchLeft aims to create an intentional space that highlights and empowers all artists for whom radical creativity is not a choice, but a necessity. LaunchLeft begins with music, but its ultimate aim is to launch left-of-center artists in all creative fields.